He said I'd never be needed by anyone, that I was a mistake, an unnecessary part of the house. Then he had an accident, and out of everyone he called me, the same one he'd crossed out of his life. Growing up in our house felt like living in a constant shadow. My old man had this way of looking at me like I was something that had accidentally wandered into his life and never quite figured out how to leave. Every morning at breakfast, he'd glance over his coffee cup with those tired eyes and shake his head slightly, like he was disappointed all over again that I was still there. My brother was different. He had this golden glow around him that made everything he touched seem important. When he walked into a room, the old man's whole face would change. His shoulders would straighten up, and suddenly there was this energy in the air like something exciting was about to happen. They'd talk about sports, about plans for the weekend, about anything really, and I'd sit there picking at my cereal wondering what it felt like to be worth talking to. The old man worked construction back then, came home with dirt under his fingernails and concrete dust in his hair. He'd sit in his recliner after dinner, beer in hand, and call my brother over to tell him about the job site, about the crew, about life. I'd hover nearby, hoping maybe this time he'd notice me standing there, but his eyes would just slide past me like I was part of the furniture. School wasn't much better. I was the kid who ate lunch alone, not because I was unpopular exactly, but because I never quite figured out how to be interesting enough for anyone to remember. My grades were okay, not great, just okay. The kind of okay that doesn't get you praised or punished, just ignored. Even my teachers seemed to forget my name sometimes, calling me by the name of whatever kid sat near me. At home, family dinners were like watching a play where I wasn't given a script. My brother would talk about his day, his friends, his plans, and the old man would nod and ask questions and actually seem interested. When they occasionally turned to me asking how school was or what I was up to, my answers always felt flat and boring even to me. Eventually, they stopped asking. The worst part wasn't the yelling or the criticism. The worst part was the silence. The way conversations would pause when I entered a room, then resume as if nothing had happened. The way my brother and the old man would make plans right in front of me without thinking to include me. The way I'd hear them laughing together in the garage or the backyard, and when I'd wander over to see what was funny, the laughter would just fade away. My brother left for college when I was 16. I thought maybe things would change, maybe with him gone the old man would finally notice me. Instead, it was like someone had turned off the main lights in the house. He became quieter, more distant, spending most evenings in his chair staring at the television without really watching it. Sometimes he'd get phone calls from my brother, and I'd hear his voice come alive again from the other room, animated and warm in a way it never was when he talked to me. I started staying out later, not because I had anywhere special to go, but because coming home to that quiet house felt worse than wandering around town by myself. I'd walk through neighborhoods looking at lit windows, imagining what it would be like to live in houses where people were excited to see each other. Sometimes I'd sit on park benches until it got dark, just to delay going back to a place where I felt like a guest who'd overstayed their welcome. The old man never asked where I'd been, never seemed to notice if I was there or not. When I graduated high school, he came to the ceremony and sat in the back, checking his phone most of the time. Afterward, when other families were taking pictures and making plans for dinner, he just nodded at me and said we should head home because he had work in the morning. I didn't go to college, couldn't afford it, and honestly couldn't figure out what I'd even study. Instead, I got a job at a warehouse, moving boxes and loading trucks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. I moved into a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, just a place where I could exist without feeling like I was taking up space that belonged to someone else. For a while, I barely saw the old man. Maybe once a month I'd stop by the house, more out of obligation than anything else. These visits were awkward and brief. He'd ask how work was going. I'd say fine. He'd nod and turn back to whatever he was doing. Sometimes I'd try to start a real conversation, ask him about his job or mention something I'd seen on the news, but his responses were always short and distracted, like he was waiting for me to leave so he could get back to his real life. My brother would call me sometimes, usually when he was feeling guilty about not staying in touch with the family. He'd moved to another state after college, got married, started building the kind of life that looked good in Christmas cards. During these calls, he'd ask about the old man, and I'd tell him what little I knew. Then he'd promise to visit soon, though soon never seemed to come. Years passed like this. I worked, paid my bills, came home to my empty apartment, and tried not to think too much about what my life was supposed to look like. Sometimes I'd run into people from high school who'd ask what I was up to, and I'd give them the basic facts about my job and my apartment. But even to me it sounded like I was describing someone else's life, someone who was just going through the motions. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at work, mindlessly stacking boxes, when my phone rang. The number looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. When I answered, it was a voice I didn't recognize, professional and careful, asking if I was related to my father. My stomach dropped before they even finished the question. They told me there'd been an incident at the construction site. Equipment malfunction, they said. He was in the hospital, stable but seriously injured. They'd found my number in his wallet as an emergency contact, which surprised me more than anything else they'd said. I hadn't known he carried my number with him. The drive to the hospital felt endless. I kept thinking about all the things I should have said to him over the years, all the conversations we'd never had. I imagined him lying there thinking about his life, maybe realizing he'd wasted too much time being distant from his own son. Maybe this would be the moment everything changed between us. When I got to his room, he was awake but groggy from medication. His legs were elevated and wrapped in thick bandages, and there were machines beeping around him. He looked smaller than I remembered, older and more fragile. When he saw me walk in, his expression didn't change much, just a slight nod like he'd been expecting me. The doctors explained that he'd suffered severe damage to his lower spine. There was a chance he might walk again with extensive therapy, but it would be a long road, and there were no guarantees. In the meantime, he'd need help with basic daily activities. They mentioned rehabilitation facilities and home care options, talking around the obvious question of who would be responsible for making these decisions. That first week, I visited every day after work. Not because we suddenly had emotional breakthroughs or heart-to-heart conversations, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. He was usually tired from physical therapy or meetings with doctors, so our interactions were brief and practical. I'd ask how he was feeling, he'd give a short answer, and we'd sit in comfortable enough silence until visiting hours ended. What struck me most was how different he seemed without his usual environment. At home, he'd always been this solid, immovable presence, someone who knew exactly how everything should be and wasn't interested in other opinions. Here in the hospital bed, dependent on nurses and machines, he looked uncertain for the first time in my memory. My brother flew in for a weekend, full of energy and concern and plans for how to handle everything. He talked to doctors, researched rehabilitation centers, and made lists of what needed to be done. But when Monday came and he had to fly back to his job and his family, all those plans stayed behind as suggestions and good intentions. After my brother left, something shifted. The old man seemed quieter, more withdrawn. The nurses mentioned that he wasn't participating in physical therapy with the same effort as before. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said he was tired. But I could see something else in his eyes, something that looked like disappointment or maybe resignation. The doctors started talking about discharge planning. He could go to a rehabilitation facility, but insurance would only cover so much. He could hire home care, but that was expensive and would eat through his savings quickly. Her family could help provide care at home, which was what most people in his situation ended up doing. The unspoken question hung in the air during every meeting. Who exactly was going to step up? I found myself thinking about it constantly. This man who'd made me feel invisible for most of my life now needed someone to see him, to help him with the most basic and private aspects of daily living. It would mean rearranging my entire life, probably moving back into the house I'd been so eager to escape, becoming responsible for someone who'd never seemed to think I was responsible for anything. But what kept coming back to me was the memory of finding out I was his emergency contact. He could have listed my brother, or a coworker, or even no one at all. Instead, he'd written down my name and number on a piece of paper and carried it in his wallet. Maybe it didn't mean anything, just practicality since I lived closest. Or maybe it meant he'd been thinking about me more than he'd ever let on. The decision, when it came, didn't feel like a decision at all. It felt more like finally admitting something I'd known all along. I told the discharge planner that he could come home, that I'd be there to help him transition. The old man didn't say much when I told him, just nodded and looked out the window. But something in his posture relaxed, like he'd been holding his breath and could finally let it out. Update 1. Moving back into my childhood home felt like stepping into a museum of my own disappointments. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, from the worn spot on the carpet where the old man's recliner sat to the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless silent dinners. But now I was seeing it all through different eyes, not as the kid who'd never quite belonged, but as the adult who was choosing to be here. The first few weeks were harder than I'd expected. Not just the physical aspects of helping him get around, though those were challenging enough. It was the awkwardness of suddenly being essential to someone who'd spent years making me feel optional. He needed help getting in and out of bed, help with showering, help with things that required a level of intimacy and trust that we'd never had in our relationship. At first, he was embarrassed about needing assistance, trying to do things himself even when it was clearly painful or impossible. I'd hear him struggling in the bathroom and wait outside the door, giving him time to ask for help before I offered it. Eventually, he started accepting my presence without the prideful resistance, though he never quite seemed comfortable with the role reversal. The routine we developed was simple but constant. I'd help him get ready in the morning before I left for work, make sure he had everything he needed within reach, then check on him during my lunch break and spend the evening helping with dinner and whatever else came up. Weekends were devoted to doctor appointments, grocery shopping, and the 100 small tasks that keep a household running. What surprised me was how natural it felt once we got past the initial weirdness. Not the emotional part, that was still complicated, but the practical rhythm of caring for someone. I'd always thought of myself as someone who wasn't good at important things, but keeping track of medications and managing appointments and making sure the house was safe for someone with mobility issues turned out to be skills I could learn. The old man started physical therapy as an outpatient, and I'd drive him to appointments twice a week. Sitting in those waiting rooms, watching other families navigate similar situations, I started to understand that what we were doing wasn't unusual or particularly noble. It was just what people did when someone they cared about needed help. The caring part was what I was still figuring out. He was making progress with the therapy, slow but measurable. Some days he could walk short distances with a walker, other days the pain was too much and he stayed in the wheelchair. The therapist said this was normal, that recovery wasn't a straight line, but I could see how the bad days frustrated him. He'd always been someone who fixed problems through effort and determination, and this was a problem that couldn't be solved that way. My brother called regularly at first, asking for updates and offering to help coordinate care or research equipment. But as weeks turned into months, the calls became less frequent. He had his own life happening, work pressures and kids' activities and all the normal complications of being an adult. I didn't resent him for it exactly, but I noticed the difference between offering help and actually providing it. The house started to feel different too. Not warmer exactly, but less empty. There was someone else's schedule to consider, someone else's needs to plan around. I found myself picking up groceries he liked, adjusting the thermostat to his preference, staying home on evenings when I might have gone out. Not because he asked me to, but because it felt wrong to leave him alone for too long. Slowly, very slowly, we started having real conversations. Not deep or emotional ones, but practical talks that gradually included more personal details. He'd mention something about his job, and I'd ask follow-up questions. I'd tell him about something that had happened at work, and he'd actually listen and respond. These weren't the meaningful heart-to-hearts I'd imagined as a kid, but they were real communication between two adults sharing the same space. One evening, about 3 months after he'd come home, I was helping him get settled in bed when he said something that stopped me cold. He mentioned that my brother had called earlier and told him about a promotion at work, how proud he was of what my brother had accomplished. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said he was proud of what I was doing too, taking care of things at home. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to point out that this was the first time he'd ever said he was proud of me for anything. Part of me wanted to ask why it had taken him ending up in a wheelchair for him to notice I was capable of handling responsibility. But mostly I just felt this weird mix of satisfaction and sadness, like I'd finally gotten something I'd wanted for so long that I'd forgotten I was still waiting for it. The real turning point came about a month later, during one of those random moments that end up meaning more than anyone expects. I was making dinner, something simple since cooking had never been my strong suit, when I heard him struggling to reach something in the living room. By the time I got there, he'd managed to grab what he needed, but the effort had clearly worn him out. Instead of pretending it hadn't happened, like we usually would, he looked up at me and said he was grateful I was there. Not in a dramatic or overly emotional way, just a simple statement of fact. He said he knew it wasn't easy, changing my whole life to help him, and he appreciated it. Then he went back to whatever he'd been doing, like it was just another normal comment about the weather. But it wasn't normal, at least not for us. It was acknowledgement, maybe even respect. It was him seeing me as someone who'd made a choice and followed through on it. Someone who was capable of doing something that mattered. It wasn't an apology for all the years of feeling invisible, but it was recognition that I was visible now. Update 2. 6 months into this new routine, something unexpected happened. The old man started getting better, not just physically, but in ways I hadn't anticipated. The physical therapy was working better than anyone had predicted, and he was regaining strength and mobility faster than the doctors had expected. But more than that, he seemed to be discovering parts of himself that had been buried under years of work and routine and whatever disappointments had made him so distant. He started reading again, something I'd never seen him do when I was growing up. Books about history and biography, thick paperbacks he'd order online and work through slowly. When I'd ask him about what he was reading, he'd actually tell me, not just the plot, but what he thought about it, what connections he was making to his own life. These conversations were unlike anything we'd ever had before, real exchanges of ideas rather than the surface-level interactions that had defined our relationship. The house started feeling more alive, too. He began taking an interest in things he'd let slide for years, like the garden that had been overgrown since my mother died when I was 12. From his wheelchair, he'd direct me in clearing out dead plants and preparing soil for new ones. It became a weekend project we worked on together, him planning and instructing, me providing the physical labor he couldn't manage yet. What struck me most was how much he seemed to know about things I'd never heard him discuss before. Turns out he understood plants and soil and growing seasons, knowledge he'd picked up somewhere along the way but never had reason to use. Working in that garden, I started to see him as someone with depths I'd never explored, not because he'd hidden them, but because I'd never thought to look. My brother visited again around this time, and the difference in the house was obvious even to him. Instead of the quiet, slightly depressing atmosphere he'd encountered during his first visit after the accident, he found the old man engaged and active, making plans and talking about projects. During dinner, the three of us had the kind of conversation I'd always imagined other families had, where everyone contributed and listened and built on what others were saying. But something else became clear during that visit. My brother kept talking about his own life, his job pressures and his kids' activities and his wife's career, all the complex juggling that filled his days. He was living the kind of busy, successful life that everyone's supposed to want, but listening to him, I realized I didn't envy it anymore. His life sounded exhausting, full of obligations and expectations and constant movement toward goals that would only be replaced by new goals. Meanwhile, I was discovering that the quiet life I'd been living, the one that had always seemed so empty and purposeless, actually had its own rhythm and meaning. Taking care of the house, helping the old man with his recovery, working at a job that paid the bills without consuming my entire identity, it wasn't glamorous, but it was solid and real in mine. The old man was noticing this too. He'd started asking me about my work, not just whether it was going okay, but what I thought about it, whether I was satisfied with it, what I might want to do differently. These weren't the dismissive questions of someone who expected me to have no real ambitions, but genuine curiosity about my thoughts and feelings. It was like he was finally seeing me as a complete person rather than just a disappointment or an afterthought. One evening, while we were sitting outside watching the sun go down, he told me something that changed everything. He said he'd been thinking about his life, about all the years he'd spent focused on work and achievement, and trying to make sure my brother had every opportunity to succeed. He said he'd gotten so caught up in that project that he'd lost sight of other things that mattered, other people who mattered. He didn't explicitly apologize for the years of making me feel invisible, but he didn't need to. What he was saying was bigger than an apology. He was admitting that he'd been wrong about what was important, that he'd measured success in ways that had caused him to miss the value of different kinds of people living different kinds of lives. Then he said something that I'm still processing months later. He said that watching me over the past several months, seeing how I'd handled responsibility and change and challenge, had made him realize that maybe I'd been the stronger one all along. Not stronger in the obvious ways like my brother, with his achievements and his confidence and his ability to navigate complex social and professional situations, but stronger in the ways that mattered when life got difficult. He said I'd always been steady, even when I was young, even when he was too focused on other things to notice. While my brother was charming and ambitious and successful at getting attention and opportunities, I'd been reliable and thoughtful and present. Those weren't qualities that got rewarded in obvious ways, but they were qualities that made me someone people could count on when things got hard. This wasn't the dramatic reconciliation scene I'd sometimes imagined as a kid, with tears and apologies and promises that everything would be different from now on. It was quieter than that, more like a gradual recognition of something that had always been true but had taken both of us a long time to see clearly. Around this time, I started thinking about what would happen when he didn't need as much help anymore. His recovery was progressing well enough that the doctors were talking about him regaining most of his independence within the next year. Part of me was relieved at the prospect of getting my own life back, But another part of me realized I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to the way things were before. The old man seemed to be thinking about this too. He'd started talking about modifications he wanted to make to the house, not just for accessibility, but for comfort and functionality. He mentioned projects we could work on together, improvements that would take months to complete. It was like he was making plans that assumed I'd still be around, still be part of his daily life even when he didn't strictly need my help anymore. I found myself making similar assumptions. When I thought about the future, it included this house and this routine and this relationship we built. Not because I felt obligated to stay, but because I discovered something here that I'd been looking for my whole life without knowing it. I'd found a place where I belonged, where my presence made a difference, where someone was genuinely glad to see me at the end of each day. The revelation came during another one of those ordinary moments that end up being more significant than anyone expects. I was helping him with some paperwork, insurance forms and medical bills, and all the administrative aftermath of a major injury. As we worked through the documents, he mentioned that he'd been thinking about updating his will and his emergency contacts and all the other legal details people usually avoid dealing with. He said he wanted to make sure I was listed as his primary contact for everything, not just because I lived closest, but because I was the person he trusted most to make good decisions about his care if something happened. He said he'd learned over the past months that I had better judgment than he'd given me credit for, that I could handle complicated situations without getting overwhelmed or making impulsive choices. Then he said something that made me understand how much had really changed between us. He said that before the accident, he'd worried about what would happen to me when he was gone, whether I'd be able to take care of myself, whether I had the skills and strength to handle adult responsibilities. Now he wasn't worried about that anymore. If anything, he said, he was confident that I'd be fine, that I'd built a life that was solid and meaningful even if it didn't look like what other people might expect. Final update. A year later, the old man was walking again. Not perfectly, and not without effort, but well enough to live independently if he wanted to. The doctors were calling his recovery remarkable, especially for someone his age. But what felt more remarkable to me was the relationship we'd built during those months when he needed my help. I'd moved back to my apartment briefly when he first regained most of his mobility, thinking we both needed space to figure out what our dynamic would be now that the crisis had passed. But within a few weeks, we were spending most evenings together anyway, him coming over for dinner or me stopping by the house to work on projects we'd started. The routine we'd developed felt too valuable to abandon just because it was no longer medically necessary. Eventually, I moved back into the house permanently. Not because he needed a caregiver, but because we'd become something we'd never been before. A family that actually enjoyed each other's company. The spare bedroom became my room again, but this time it felt like a choice rather than a default. My brother was puzzled by this arrangement when he visited. He couldn't understand why I'd want to live with our father when I didn't have to, why I'd choose a quiet life in a small town when I could be building a career somewhere else. But his confusion just confirmed what I'd come to understand about the difference between us. He needed movement and achievement and external validation to feel worthwhile. I needed stability and purpose and genuine connection. The old man and I settled into a rhythm that worked for both of us. We'd eat breakfast together before I left for work, talking about plans for the day or things we'd read in the news. Evenings were spent on house projects or garden work or just sitting on the porch talking about whatever came to mind. Weekends included longer projects, trips to hardware stores or nurseries, and the kind of comfortable companionship that develops between people who genuinely like each other's company. What surprised me most was how little resentment I felt about all those years when things were different. I'd expected that getting closer to him would make me angrier about the time we'd lost, but instead it made me grateful for the time we'd found. Maybe it had taken a crisis to get us here, but we were here now, and that seemed more important than analyzing how we could have arrived sooner. The old man seemed to feel the same way. He'd mentioned things from when I was younger sometimes, memories I'd forgotten or moments I hadn't realized he'd noticed. But he talked about them without regret or apology, just as part of the story that had led us to where we were now. It was like he'd made peace with his own mistakes and moved on to focusing on what could still be built rather than what had been broken. People at work started commenting on how different I seemed, more confident and settled. I'd never realized how much energy I'd been spending on feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere, like I was always slightly out of place wherever I happened to be. Now that I had somewhere I clearly belonged, everything else felt easier too. The old man started talking about retirement, not because he had to, but because he wanted to spend more time on projects that interested him. He'd accumulated enough savings and benefits to live comfortably without working, and he was excited about having more time for the garden and the house improvements and the books he wanted to read. He talked about these plans like they included me, like we were building a shared future rather than just managing a temporary situation. My brother called one evening to tell us he'd gotten another promotion, a big one that would require his family to relocate across the country. As he talked about the opportunities and challenges ahead, I realized I didn't feel the old familiar envy of his success. His life sounded exciting and demanding and full of possibilities, but it also sounded exhausting and uncertain. I was genuinely happy for him, but I was also genuinely happy not to be him. After my brother hung up, the old man and I sat quietly for a while, both of us thinking about the different paths lives can take. Finally, he said something that perfectly captured what I'd been feeling but couldn't quite articulate. He said he was proud of both his sons, but in completely different ways. He was proud of my brother for chasing big dreams and achieving impressive things. And he was proud of me for building something solid and lasting and real. He said he learned that there were different ways to live a successful life, that success didn't always look like climbing ladders or accumulating achievements. Sometimes success looked like being the kind of person others could count on, like creating stability and peace in a small corner of the world, like finding contentment in simple things done well. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom that had become my adult bedroom, I thought about the journey that had brought us both to this place. It hadn't been a straight line or an easy path, but it had led somewhere good. The old man who'd once made me feel invisible now saw me more clearly than anyone else in my life. The house that had once felt like a place I didn't belong had become the place where I most wanted to be. I'd spent years thinking I was missing out on some other life, some better version of myself that existed in a different place with different people. But what I'd actually been missing was the ability to see value in the life I already had, to recognize that belonging somewhere didn't require being the most important person in the room or the most successful person in the family. It just required being genuinely yourself in a place where that self was welcomed and appreciated. The old man never explicitly said he was sorry for all those years of making me feel like I didn't matter. But every day now, in dozens of small ways, he showed me that I did matter, that my presence in his life was something he valued and enjoyed. And I never explicitly forgave him for those years of feeling invisible, but every day I chose to stay, to build this relationship we'd discovered, to focus on what we had now rather than what we'd missed before. Some stories end with dramatic revelations or tearful reconciliations or promises that everything will be different from now on. This story ended with something quieter but more lasting, the recognition that we'd both been looking for the same thing all along, just in different ways. We both wanted to matter to someone, to feel essential rather than optional, to know that our presence in the world made a difference to at least one other person. It had taken him ending up in a hospital bed and me stepping up to help for us to discover that we could give each other exactly what we'd been looking for. Not in the dramatic, movie scene way I'd sometimes imagined as a kid, but in the steady, daily reality of two people choosing to build a life together that worked for both of them. The old man was right about one thing. I had been drifting through life for a long time, not quite sure where I was supposed to be or what I was supposed to be doing. But I wasn't drifting anymore. I'd found my place, my purpose, my family. It wasn't the life I'd planned or the relationship I'd expected, but it was mine, and it was good, and it was enough.